Uh, and we are recording. The three little dots where you can change your name and choose a different background, whatever. In the upper right-hand corner of Zoom, there is a view option, and you can click that. You're not going to mess up the presentation at all. And I like to do it on speaker view, so then you don't have to look at everyone and you're just seeing the presentation. If you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and politely ask a question. You can also type your question in the chat, which is at the bottom. And Milan, the ACE co-host here, will keep an eye on the chat. And Milan, if someone does type in the chat, just say, hey, we have a question, and it is, this is the question. I think that kind of covers it all. You found us, so you either follow us on Facebook, Instagram, you found us on Eventbrite, Now Playing Utah. You can sign up for emails at altacommunity.org. You can go to our website, altacommunity.org, just to check out our events and other things that we are doing. It's kind of, choose your own poison on how you find out about us and which platform that you spend your time on. But thank you so much for coming. And I will do our formal introduction. Dr. Brent Kious is Assistant Professor of Psychology at the Huntsman Mental Health Institute at the University of Utah. He provides care for hospitalized adult patients at HMHI and conducts research on the effects of altitude on depression, the use of nutritional supplements to treat depression, and the impact of crisis services on suicide risk and psychiatric ethics. So I will pass it off to you, Brent.
Thanks so much for having me, Sarah. This is a great pleasure. And I'm going to share some slides. I'm an academic and do a lot of research, and I'm used to giving kind of academic presentations. So I'm just going to apologize in advance because it might wax technical at some points. But I want to say that I'd like to keep the conversation kind of going and informal. And so if you have questions at any point as I'm talking, unmute yourself and ask, or try to raise your virtual hand. I can only see like one person at a time on Zoom while I'm sharing the slides. But hopefully you can get my attention and then we can just talk about what's on your mind. So here's a little bit about what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to spend a bit of time on the epidemiology of suicide and also depression and how those might relate to altitude, which is relevant for all of us here in Utah, but probably particularly relevant for folks living up in the Cottonwood Canyons. I'm going to talk some about the biology that we think might be behind this connection between altitude and suicide. And then a little bit about some of the clinical trials that we're doing and some of our other research, and also touch briefly on other options people might use to treat depression and related psychiatric symptoms if they're living at high elevation like most of us are. So I think it's no secret to anybody here that suicide is a big problem in Utah. We have been in the news a lot nationally. This was a pretty widely read Wall Street Journal article about the epidemic of teen high school suicide in Harriman, where 6 young adults or teens, all from the same high school, ended their own lives within a year. They all knew each other. We know that suicide often tends to cluster socially in social groups. There's something called social contagion, but it's a bigger problem in Utah than that. So unfortunately, we see episodes like this a lot more often than we really should. This is from the same story, and it kind of shows how the suicide rate in Utah specifically has changed over time. It's gradually increased, at least it did up until about 2017, 2018. You might have seen in the Trib today a report from the Office of the Medical Examiner that our suicide rate among teens, at least, seems to be leveling off a little bit. That's kind of good news, except it's leveling off at a very high level compared to the rest of the country. So it's not as though we're doing well, it's just not getting dramatically worse. If you look at suicide rates across the country, I think a fairly striking trend often emerges. This is data from 2020. It's the most recent I could find, published by AFSP. And it shows how the suicide rates vary. So darker colors tend to be higher rates. And you'll notice that all of the states here in the Intermountain West, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, et cetera, tend to have higher rates than the rest of the country. There's been a little bit of an uptick in Kansas and Missouri and Oklahoma, et cetera. But we have consistently, for as long as we've been looking at this data, which really goes back to about 2004, beat the rest of the country with respect to suicide rates. Utah is often in the top 3. It's slipped down a little bit as places like Montana and Wyoming have gotten quite a bit worse. So suicide rates have been increasing across the country. They have generally been increasing in Utah. And it's a terrible epidemic that has gotten worse despite the fact that we have tried for a long while to fight suicide and to do better at preventing it and treating the conditions that contribute to it. So this is data from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's a federal agency, and they've kind of kept track of how much we've been spending per person on mental health over the years, really starting back in 2000. So that's increased quite a bit from about $580 per person up to about $720. And there have been more and more efforts to prevent suicide, and yet suicide rates just keep climbing. So whatever we're doing, it's not working. And one of the things that our group, led by Perry Renshaw and a number of others here at HMHI, have been trying to do is find better ways of preventing suicide and treating the conditions that contribute to it. So just another way of looking at some of this information, if you examine causes of death across most age groups in the United States, this is data from 2015, suicide rises up to the top, especially in younger people. So there have been years actually where suicide was the leading cause of death in young adults. It's often number 2 or number 3, following unintentional injury like car accidents and falls and things of that nature. So it has been a very significant problem that has caused a lot of excess mortality. It's caused us to lose a lot of important people prematurely. Similar things might be true for suicidal ideation. So, in psychiatry, we distinguish between suicide attempts and suicide death and suicidal ideation, and there are all kinds of degrees of suicidal ideation. The data about the prevalence of suicidal ideation is not nearly as good as the data about suicide deaths, but it also kind of looks like we tend to have more suicidal ideation in the Intermountain West and Utah and neighboring states than the rest of the country. Although, other places in the South, places like Oregon also tend to have relatively high rates of that. And, the discrepancy is interesting. It means that there are lots of people who have suicidal thoughts who don't ultimately go on to die of suicide or necessarily even make suicide attempts. What about depression? So depression is a huge problem. In some studies, it is maybe the second leading cause of disability. In this World Health Organization data from 2017, it is across all countries one of the leading causes of disability. So, that includes around the globe things like malaria, cancer, heart disease, if you look at years of productive life lost, which doesn't necessarily mean people dying, but people not being able to work or contribute to their communities as effectively as they might, depression is a major, major problem. And depression is extremely common in the United States. This is 2015 data roughly. About 10% of 18 to 25-year-olds would meet criteria for a major depressive episode within any given year-long period. It gets a little bit less for older folks. It's more common in women, almost twice as common actually among women as it is among men. It varies a lot by race. So it's more common in Caucasian persons, and then in American Indian and Alaskan Native persons, and persons of mixed ancestry. Depression also seems to vary quite a bit geographically. This is relatively old data from some federal studies that were done in around 2004. And it found that, there was a cluster of states with disproportionately high rates of depression, again, in the Intermountain West. West Virginia also ranks up there, and it also tends to have relatively high suicide rates compared to the rest of the country. Although I think that's probably consistent with our idea that altitude might play a role in all of this. So, this is just a map of elevation in the country, and it's no surprise to anybody here that the Intermountain West is just a heck of a lot higher than the rest of the country. Our average elevation in Salt Lake City is 4,500 feet. It's quite a bit higher than that up in Park City and other parts of the state. And we think it's really no surprise that that should have some kind of physiological impact, and more importantly, an impact on our mental health. So this is where it gets a little bit technical. I'm just going to kind of summarize some of the stuff that I think is interesting here. So we've hypothesized, and a number of other researchers around the country have hypothesized, that altitude itself is a risk factor for suicide death, in that living at higher elevation tends to increase the population risk of suicide. So this has been studied systematically since about 2002. David Cheng was at the University of Cincinnati and looked at suicide rates across all the capital counties, so like Salt Lake County, across all the states, and found that there was a clear association between the altitude of those counties and their suicide rates. Now, if you think about it for a minute, that's not a particularly good way of assessing the association between altitude and suicide risk, because there are lots of things that you're not measuring there. There are lots of other counties that you're not considering. So a slightly more sophisticated study involves over 3,000 US counties conducted by the same group, where they also, again, saw an association between altitude and suicide. And then they did some statistical tricks to control for the income of those counties, because we know things like poverty are associated with suicide rates. And maybe it just happens that higher altitude counties have more poverty, and so more suicide as a result. Turns out that's not the case. Even if you take into account poverty rates, suicide and altitude still seem to be linked. It gets even more complicated as we get further into the data. So in this study in 2009, they looked at capital city altitudes over about 5 years. And here they adjusted for age distributions, race distributions, sex. And then they looked at peak altitude of the state as well as capital city altitude, still finding very clear links between altitude and suicide. And I just lost my window. Sorry, one of the defects of being on a Mac. There we go. Yeah. So in a somewhat more recent study, they looked at the altitude of the geographic center of each county may be a better way of representing the average altitude of each geographic area. And again, found that suicide increased with altitude, even though your overall likelihood of dying decreased with altitude. And so in some respects, it's actually healthier to live at higher elevation, maybe because those of us who live at high altitude tend to be more involved in outdoor sports and tend to be exercise fanatics and things of that sort. Importantly, in this study, they tried to control for firearm ownership in a somewhat indirect way. So if you consider the things that might explain away the apparent association between altitude and suicide risk, one of the most plausible ones is firearm ownership. People who live in the mountains tend to be more interested in outdoor sports and other kinds of outdoor activities. They tend to live in rural areas. Maybe they're more likely to own guns. And as we'll talk about in more detail later, owning a gun is a really big risk factor for dying of suicide. But here they found that even if you looked at all the people who didn't die of self-inflicted gunshot wound, so these are people who died of suffocation or overdose or crashing their car, altitude still increased the risk that that was going to happen. So hopefully at this point, I've kind of persuaded you that there's a robust statistical connection between altitude and suicide risk. In that same study that I just mentioned, they also looked at how the risk of suicide maps out according to elevation. And they found a very interesting thing, we think, which is that overall, it's about the same across a lot of elevations until you get to about 4,500 feet or 4,000 feet, and then the risk of suicide increases quite dramatically. It's almost like there's a step function. So the impact of altitude on people living in that area doesn't really accumulate or contribute to mental health changes until you get to be, unfortunately, at about the altitude of Salt Lake City. And then there is a very dramatic impact. So I think our group has done some of the most compelling research about this subject. I'm biased, of course. So we looked at 3,100 counties across the country. And here we just very specifically controlled for state level data about firearm ownership and looked again at firearm related as well as non-firearm related suicides and found that the association between suicide and altitude was very tight. As altitude increases, your suicide risk just tends to increase in an almost linear fashion. Some people have criticized this. So Lawrence Betts is a researcher, an ER doctor at the University of Colorado. And they have a group there that has long criticized our research and sort of poo-pooed the connection between suicide and altitude. So they published a study in 2011, and they looked at suicide rates adjusted for population density in 3 different geographic groupings, places that were at high altitude, at middle altitude, and at low altitude. And they found that, in fact, there was still a higher suicide rate at the high altitude groups compared to the others, and it kind of went down with lower elevation. But they said, look, this is a spurious association because if you examine things like race, rates of depression, rates of substance use, rates of violence, employment or unemployment, and lots of other sociodemographic factors, those are also significantly different. And our response is, well, yes, but if you control for those factors, you still see an association. And by the way, things like substance use and depression and violence are probably some of the factors that mediate the connection between altitude and suicide anyway, because we know that all of those things increase an individual's risk for dying of suicide. So we have also looked a bit at the association between altitude and depression. Generally speaking, although again, the data about the geographic distribution of depression is not nearly as good as that for suicide, we still see an association. So living at higher elevation is statistically, even when we control for lots of sociodemographic factors that vary geographically, a pretty strong one. Now, one interesting thing we don't know is the effect of altitude, or I should say, one thing that we didn't really know until recently was whether the effect of altitude is one that has to do with having lived at altitude for a long time, or is something that can affect somebody when they have moved to high altitude from, say, sea level or a different elevation. And I think that if we found that a change in altitude increased someone's risk of suicide, that would be more compelling evidence that altitude itself was playing a direct role, right? Change that one variable in kind of a natural experiment. And if you see an effect, you can be pretty sure that it's that variable that's been changed that is causing the effect. So we actually came across a data set that was really helpful in studying this. So medical interns are people who have just graduated from medical school, and then they've gone off to residency somewhere. And they will often start off at a place like UCLA in Los Angeles, where I did medical school. And then they'll move to someplace like Utah, like I did for residency. This study called the Intern Health Study, which has been run at the University of Michigan for quite a while, has tracked people as they've moved from medical school to residency, and then asked them about depression and anxiety and other behaviors that are linked to mental health during the first year of their residency program. So that gave us the opportunity to figure out what happens to somebody if they start off in medical school without depression, then they move to a place like Salt Lake City for their residency. Do they get more depressed? Do they start to have more suicidal ideation? Do they have more anxiety? And so we actually examined that data, and I'll skip over this. It's just kind of basic demographic stuff. So, at baseline, and sorry, I should say the PHQ-9 is a scale that measures depression. It's called the Patient Health Questionnaire, has 9 items. If you go to your primary care doctor, they will probably give this to you at one point or another to see whether you're depressed or not. The GAD-7 is a measure of anxiety. And then item 9 on the PHQ-9 is specifically about suicide. So have you had suicidal ideation in the last week? So overall, this is the aggregate data for everybody in the study. People got a little bit more depressed when they were in residency. That's because residency sucks. It's much harder than being a medical student. You have to work long hours and people yell at you, and it's very stressful. So that's not a big surprise at all. But when we looked at PHQ-9 scores and their association with altitude, what we found was there was a slight link between somebody's score increasing a little bit more than we would expect and them living at a higher altitude. And I should say this association here is actually looking at every meter increment in altitude. So as you go up by every meter, the odds that you get more depressed and get another point on that PHQ-9 score get a little bit higher than they would if you stayed at the same elevation. So that's not super impressive. I was a little bit disappointed with that finding, even though it's a positive one. And what we looked at instead was whether moving from a low elevation place like, say, Los Angeles to a high elevation place like Denver or Salt Lake City was itself associated with a dramatic change in depression scores. And what we found was that there was a very strong association. So when people moved from low elevation, like sea level, to high elevation, that's above 900 meters, their odds of developing depression on the PHQ-9 score were twice what everybody else in the study experienced. So clearly moving to a high elevation had some kind of effect. And the effect of altitude changes like that was as powerful as being a woman, right? And remember, we saw earlier that women are almost twice as likely to be depressed as men are. It was actually almost as strong, although these numbers are kind of inverted, as the effect of having a previous history of depression. So pretty powerful. We looked at anxiety too and found that there was an association there. And that's not really a surprise because we know in psychiatry and psychology that depression and anxiety are very tightly linked to each other. Most people who have depression have pretty significant anxiety, and a lot of people who have anxiety will ultimately develop depression. And then again, we looked at suicidal ideation in this study, and we found that although the effect was not quite as high, there was still a statistically significant link between moving from low to high altitude and developing suicidal ideation and reporting it on the PHQ-9 score. So we've pretty well persuaded ourselves, at least, although I think Betts and those others at the University of Colorado still don't believe it, that altitude is associated with suicide. And we think that it's probably associated with suicide in part because of its impact on depression, although our guess is that that's not the whole of the story. Altitude probably does other things to the way we think and feel that contribute to depression, or sorry, to suicide, apart from the contribution to depression. So why? That's the big scientific question, right? The really hard question. There's this connection in terms of the numbers and in terms of what we see at the level of epidemiology, but what's really mediating the connection between altitude and depression and altitude and suicide? So our best guess is that it has to do with oxygen. This is just a table that shows you how the oxygen concentration that you inhale changes with altitude. So I'm currently at almost 5,000 feet, I think. My house is at 4,500 feet. So I'm inhaling 14% less oxygen where I live now than I did when I was living in Los Angeles. That's a significant difference, right? If people are deprived of oxygen for even 30 seconds sometimes in the wrong situations, they can have very significant injury or problems. It doesn't take long for somebody's heart to infarct or for them to have a heart attack if it is not getting enough oxygen. Now, you might say, well, look, but what about the Sherpas? What about the possibility of accommodating physiologically to high elevation? And we know that those kinds of things happen, right? So maybe some of you living in Alta live there only part of the year and you live elsewhere for the rest of the year. And you find when you return to Alta, you get a little bit more winded for a while, but then you accommodate. I personally found it took me about 3 months to really feel back to my usual self when I moved from Los Angeles to here. So we think that compensation is certainly a factor, but we know that it is not a complete fix to the altitude problem. So this study they did here at the university a long while ago, and they just compared oxygen levels in the blood and the overall carrying capacity for oxygen in the blood for people living in Salt Lake City and people living, again, in Los Angeles. And they found that basically across all age groups, there was a huge difference in arterial oxygen concentration between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. So there's compensation, but it's not doing everything we would want it to do. Some people in our group have done some very, very meaningful and I think compelling work with animal models. I want to say a little bit about that. So we actually use mice and rats to study depression. And you might wonder, how do you do that? Because as far as I can tell, a happy mouse is exactly the same as a sad mouse, and there's just no way of distinguishing them. But biologists have developed some very clever paradigms for studying that. When people are depressed, they tend to just give up. In fact, there's a model of depression called learned helplessness. You throw yourself against some problem time and time again, you get no traction on it, and what happens? Eventually you give up. And when mice or rats are depressed, they will do exactly the same thing. They just give up. So it seems a little bit mean, although it doesn't hurt the animals. If you put rats or mice in a vat of water in a place where they can't escape, they will swim and swim and swim and swim until eventually they just say, there's no point in this, and then they will just kind of float there placidly. If they are depressed, or exhibit what we think is the rat equivalent of depression, they give up much, much sooner, and they spend a lot less time actively trying to climb out of the cage or swimming around to find a way out. So knowing that, we actually just took a bunch of rats and we subjected them to high elevation. So we built some hypobaric chambers. This is basically like a decompression chamber that you would put a diver in, and it allows us to control air pressure very precisely. So we can mimic living at sea level. We can mimic Salt Lake City, of course. That just means it's open to the outside air. We can mimic being at the top of Mount Everest. We put the rats in there and leave them for a couple of weeks, and then we see what happens. And it turns out that those rats end up, when they're at higher elevation, looking a lot more depressed than rats that live at sea level. They tend to give up on the forced swim test much sooner. So this is kind of the data. It's very complicated. Again, biologists aren't necessarily known for their simplicity of explanation, but this figure here showing percent time immobile, I think, is the easiest one to understand. As altitude increases from sea level to 4,500 feet all the way up to 20,000 feet, so we're getting close to Mount Everest, or maybe Kalapatar in Nepal, this amount of time that female rats spent not swimming and just kind of floating there placidly went up quite dramatically. What was shocking to us is that we didn't see any similar association for male rats. So there's something very specific about the brains of female rats and possibly female humans that makes them more vulnerable to the effects of altitude than with males. So this gets us into the biology. What could relatively low oxygen do to high altitude and low atmospheric pressure have to do with the way the brain is functioning? Well, one thing we know is that the brain burns a ton of energy, and all the energy that you use in your body ultimately involves oxygen. So you have to have oxygen to generate biological forms of energy. So if you have reduced oxygen, maybe you have reduced efficiency in the production of energy and storage forms of energy, which the brain relies on a lot, and then the brain ends up not behaving the way it's supposed to do. And, oh man, this might take you back to high school biochemistry. There are these things in muscle cells and in the brain and most other cells in the body called mitochondria, and they mediate this process called oxidative phosphorylation, right? So basically, you bring glucose and other sources of nutrition in, they get broken down in a variety of ways, and then shuttled into these little powerhouses or generators in your cells and turned into biological storage forms of energy, especially something we call ATP or adenosine triphosphate. That's also often converted into something called phosphocreatine, which is related to creatine, the bodybuilding supplement. Phosphocreatine basically can sit around for a long, long time, whereas ATP tends to just sort of evaporate or get broken down automatically. So if you build up a lot of ATP, you can turn it into phosphocreatine and keep it. and then automatically turn it back into ATP when you need it, because ATP is the form of energy that our cells use most often. So we have some fancy tools, some very sophisticated MRI machines that allow us to actually measure phosphocreatine and other kinds of energy storage molecules in the brain. In college chemistry classes, they'll sometimes have you do this thing called NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, where you can figure out what a chemical is by looking at how it vibrates under a magnetic field. And we can actually do that in very, very small slices of the brain and measure indirectly chemical concentrations in areas of the brain down to now about 1 millimeter on a side. So we can tell that the front part of your brain has relatively low energy storage, but the back part of your brain has relatively normal energy storage, and even measure those changes over time. So we've actually looked at the effect of altitude on brain energy storage in human beings, comparing folks here in Salt Lake City to folks living at sea level in Massachusetts. And we found, I won't get too much into the details, that a lot of the markers of brain metabolism are very clearly different between these two groups. So brain pH is an indirect marker of the rate of cellular processes. And then the thing on the right is inorganic phosphate ratios to total phosphate. Both of those are changed very significantly. I'm not going to get into the data here, but we also know that bioenergetic changes are part of depression. So even if you study people with depression at sea level, you can see that many of them will have alterations in brain energy storage, especially in the front parts of our brain, what we call the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in higher cognitive processes, so planning, emotion regulation, things like that. And those processes tend to be most disrupted in depression. So what can we do about that? Well, a couple of seconds ago, I mentioned that you can actually maybe affect phosphocreatine levels by taking creatine, which is the bodybuilding supplement. And that's one thing that we've actually been doing in some of our clinical trials. So we can give people supplemental creatine and then measure phosphocreatine levels in their brain, and over a couple of weeks, just see clear increases there. And this is data from our colleague In-Kyun Liu, who's actually in Korea now, but they've done some really great work with adolescents. And then one of my colleagues, Doug Kondo, who's a child psychiatrist, looked at whether we could improve depression by giving, in this case, teenage girls creatine. And we found that actually, yeah, when they got creatine, their depression tended to get better on this measure of depression over about 8 weeks' time. We've done a number of clinical studies now with adults. In this study, we gave creatine to women who were taking an antidepressant but hadn't gotten better. And we found that compared to placebo, which is just a sugar pill, creatine helped their depression get better over time. So creatine seems like it's potentially a promising intervention for targeting depression and maybe ultimately suicide in people who are living at altitude, and possibly more effective in women, although we're doing studies now that also include men. And I'm pretty optimistic it's going to be helpful for men too. Another thing that might contribute to depression is changes in serotonin. So I think all of you know that serotonin is involved in depression. Most typical antidepressants like Prozac are supposed to boost serotonin levels. It turns out to be a lot more complicated than that, and there are lots of problems with the serotonin hypothesis. But we know that if you deplete serotonin in people or in rats, you can make them very depressed. So serotonin production is actually very dependent on oxygen. A little bit more chemistry for a second. Most of the serotonin that we have in our bodies comes from our diet in the form of something called tryptophan. And tryptophan is an amino acid that you get like in turkey. So, the old wives' tale about getting really tired after you eat turkey because of all the L-tryptophan in it. Well, it's actually somewhat true because tryptophan gets turned into serotonin and also into melatonin, which regulates sleep. The conversion of tryptophan into serotonin happens via this intermediate 5-hydroxytryptophan. And it involves an enzyme, a little catalytic converter in the body called tryptophan hydroxylase. Tryptophan hydroxylase is exquisitely sensitive to the amount of oxygen that you have in your body. If you reduce oxygen, tryptophan hydroxylase just shuts down. It doesn't do anything. It gives up because it doesn't have the oxygen it needs to actually work. And so you can't convert tryptophan that you eat into 5-hydroxytryptophan, and you end up not having very much serotonin. And this is in our research. This is actually done by a group in India that's very interested in the effects of altitude as well. So they took rats again, and they measured serotonin levels in their brains when they were subjected to hypobaric hypoxia, so low oxygen due to high elevation or low atmospheric pressure. And what they found was across all of these different brain regions, serotonin levels fell as hypobaric hypoxia became more intense. And we've replicated similar findings here in our group. Another thing that's worth mentioning, because it's very much in the news, is that if you're not very good at making serotonin, but you're still eating a lot of tryptophan, it might end up affecting the same pathway that's involved in depression that we target with this newfangled antidepressant, ketamine. So probably a lot of you have heard about ketamine as one of the up and coming, potentially very effective antidepressants. I won't get too much into the biochemistry, but in short, if tryptophan doesn't get turned into serotonin, it gets shunted down this pathway to become something called quinolinic acid. And that actually activates NMDA receptors. They're another kind of brain receptor. Ketamine shuts those receptors down. So it's sort of like taking anti-ketamine if you're not producing enough serotonin. So how could we target this deficit that might be contributing to depression? Well, it turns out we can actually just give people 5-hydroxytryptophan instead of tryptophan, and then we short circuit the problem with tryptophan hydroxylase that people experience at high elevation, and then they can produce more serotonin. So we've done some clinical trials of that. This is a study we published a little while ago. It was relatively small, only 27 women with depression. We found that when we gave them a combination now of 5-hydroxytryptophan, or what we call 5-HTP, and creatine, their depression just got dramatically better. So most of these patients were quite severely depressed. They'd been depressed for years. They had taken multiple antidepressants and not gotten better. And we gave them these 2 nutritional supplements in combination. And over about 8 weeks' time, 67% of them responded. So they had at least a 50% improvement in their depression scores, and almost 50% of them just got completely better, which is frankly very impressive results. If you look at clinical trials of most modern antidepressants, they don't do nearly as well. It also helped with their anxiety and other measures of depression. So anxiety got significantly better. We kind of preliminarily started to measure how their brain phosphocreatine levels were associated with the treatment and with their depression. And what we found is, so the orange dots here are their phosphocreatine concentrations in the front part of their brain, again, at baseline before we treated them. And you'll notice that all the higher HAM-D scores here are for people with orange dots. So these are at baseline. After treatment, phosphocreatine levels tended to get a bit better, not dramatically better, but significantly better. And that change in phosphocreatine levels was associated with depression getting better. So pretty exciting. This is mostly fancy pictures, but one other thing that we've been doing is measuring how different parts of the brain talk with each other and how they're connected with each other in a functional way. And this is a very well-established way for measuring depression in research studies. We know that in depression, especially those front parts of the brain don't communicate as well as they could with other parts of the brain. And we found that as we gave people this treatment with creatine and 5-hydroxytryptophan, their frontal connectivity tended to improve and look more like people who didn't have depression. So that's just kind of a summary. We're pretty excited about the combination of 5-HTP and creatine targeting these two mechanisms that altitude and low oxygen could contribute to depression and other psychiatric conditions. And we've got some big studies going on now that are looking at that in men and women. We're also very interested in studying people with respiratory illnesses like asthma and emphysema and other kinds of metabolic problems like diabetes. Okay, so that kind of covers our research. And, you know, at this point, I think people often wonder, like, is this for me? You know, if I'm struggling with depression, or if I know a family member who's struggling with depression or who might be suicidal, should I go out and take creatine and 5-hydroxytryptophan? You know, they're safe, although there are some associations between 5-HTP and something called serotonin syndrome, which can be a very serious, potentially life-threatening side effect. So at this point, I'm not necessarily recommending that as a treatment strategy to try at home. In fact, I don't really even do it with my patients yet outside of research studies. I do, though, want to emphasize some like other things that people might consider as ways of managing depression and especially managing suicide risk if they live at high elevation or anywhere else. The biggest thing is firearms. You know, our country loves guns, and there are some great things about them, but one really clear downside is that owning a gun increases your risk of dying of suicide very considerably. If you look at the percent of people who die of suicide in this country by different methods, firearms account for 31% among women. This was in 2019, and almost 56% among men. So, you know, it's not necessarily the case that if these men who died by shooting themselves didn't have access to a gun, that all of them wouldn't have died. But I bet a lot of them wouldn't have died. And if you know somebody who is potentially suicidal or who might be struggling with mental health problems, one really easy thing to do to increase safety is to get the guns out of the house. Sometimes people ask me, well, if I'm living at high altitude and the problem is low oxygen, maybe I could just take oxygen. And, you know, we haven't studied that yet. It's methodologically a little bit hard, but this group in Israel has actually done that. Although this was in people who just had ordinary depression, so they're living actually at sea level, not necessarily at high elevation. They still found that if people got extra oxygen, so 35% oxygen compared to the 21% that we usually inhale, their depression tended to get a bit better over about 4 weeks' time. So this is a promising therapy, something that we might actually end up studying. Although the drawback is that it's a lot more expensive than taking some nutritional supplements like creatine. So having home oxygen can be pretty costly in the long run, may not be very scalable. Something that's connected to hypoxia due to elevation is smoking. So people who smoke tend to be relatively hypoxic, mostly because they have carbon monoxide in their system, and so their blood cells don't function as well, but also because ultimately their lungs don't work as well. And there are very clear associations between smoking and suicide risk. This is just one study that I think is particularly clear, but you know, we've seen in lots of different data sets that if people quit smoking, their suicide risk gets better. If they start smoking again, it gets worse. And you can track those associations over time. This just looked at effects of state policies on suicide risk. What it found was that the 10 states in this country that had the weakest anti-smoking laws, including Utah, had increases in suicide rates over time. This is 1990 to 2005, whereas the states that were most aggressive in prohibiting smoking and making it harder to smoke had very significant reductions in suicide risk. Now, that obviously does not explain everything that's going on in places like Utah. Utah actually does not have very high smoking rates. We have actually quite low smoking rates compared to the rest of the country. Alcohol is another very modifiable risk factor. So, one thing I think everybody here knows is that if you drink alcohol and you're at higher elevation, it tends to have more powerful effects. That's because probably your brain is not functioning as well when it's at high elevation, and so it's more vulnerable to insults and things that make it behave differently. But we also know that alcohol affects suicide risk. So in this study, they just looked at people who were diagnosed with alcohol use disorder. This was in Sweden. And they found that within the first 5 years of being diagnosed as having alcohol use disorder or alcoholism, for men, the relative risk or the hazard ratio for suicide was almost 30 times greater than the rest of the population. And then as they got treatment and they got further and further away from alcohol use, that risk declined, getting back close to the population baseline. Again, the story is not simple. Surely people who are likely to drink and develop alcohol use disorder have underlying vulnerabilities, perhaps an underlying vulnerability to depression that predisposes them both to suicide and to drinking. But it does seem very clear that alcohol increases suicide risk. So again, something that can be modified a lot more readily than altitude. I just want to quickly end with mention of some resources, and I know we've got some great folks from NAMI and AFSP as well, I think, on the line. But the crisis line here is very accessible 24/7. There's also a warm line for peer support. SafeUT is an app that I do some research with that's run by the University of Utah. We especially market that towards teens and young adults in college, but it's really accessible to anybody. And then there's the National Suicide Prevention Line and the crisis text line that's connected to that. And a lot of people have contributed to this research. Particularly want to acknowledge Perry Renshaw, who is kind of the godfather of altitude and suicide research in Utah and has been a mentor to me for the last 5 to 10 years. Doug Kondo, I mentioned earlier. YH Sung and XF Shi do a lot of our neuroimaging. We've had a lot of great study coordinators who have helped with our research. I just want to mention too, that if anybody was interested in participating in a depression study, we're taking candidates now, currently recruiting people for the depression at altitude study, men and women ages 25 to 40. The main criterion is that you have been taking an antidepressant for at least 8 weeks and still aren't feeling better, so still clinically significant depression. You can also just track me down by email and get in touch with me that way if you're interested. So I've talked quite a bit. I am happy to take questions or just have a conversation about this stuff.
And people can unmute themselves or put their question in the chat, and to unmute is up in your upper right-hand corner.
Hey, Doc, I got a question for you. This is Dan Schilling. I don't know if you can see me, but have there been any studies for higher stress disciplines and professions that are also associated with the altitude, whether it's first responders in recreation or law enforcement, what have you? I'd be interested in that if there's anything along those lines.
Yeah, so Dan, that's a great question. And in fact, the military has been somewhat interested in this stuff, and they have done some studies at the High Altitude Military Training Center, I think it's called, which is, it's like around 12,000 or 13,000 feet. No, I think it's called the Mountain Warfare Training Center. So they take people who are like in base camp at sea level, and then they send them up there to get their mountain warfare training. And they have tracked depression and other psychiatric symptoms. And the short of it is that they got really very clear evidence that depression and impulsivity and aggression got worse for people who spent time at the high elevation. They got worse as soon as they got there, pretty quickly after, stayed bad while they were still there, and then continued to be bad for several months when they returned back to sea level. So there was some kind of lasting effect of altitude. And that was even controlling for the stresses of the training itself, so that's compared to other people doing similar training, not at elevation, excuse me.
Have you incorporated some of that into your research? And I don't want to capitalize on it. This is my final question.
We haven't specifically looked at, excuse me, dry throat. We haven't specifically looked at people with first responders, but but a lot of our colleagues here are very interested in that. And I think it's a good opportunity potentially for us to leverage that high altitude connection, especially if we can bring in groups from across the country to see whether there are more pronounced effects in first responders, fire department, police, et cetera, here in Salt Lake City compared to other places.
Great. Hey, thanks.
Yep.
We do have a question in the chat. Is this research being well received by policymakers and health programs in Utah?
Honestly, I don't think that it has hit the policy point yet. We've always kind of had a worry that real estate developers would eventually want to put the kibosh on this research. Like, please stop telling people that living at altitude is bad for you. One thing that we have emphasized a lot in trying to mitigate that is that even though altitude is clearly associated with depression, and there might be some very significant side effects of moving to Salt Lake City for some people, quality of life is actually generally better here, and people tend to be happier, right? So there's a sort of happiness paradox. We have really high suicide rates and have also often been one of the happiest states in the country. So maybe you could think about altitude as kind of causing extremes, right? It pushes people who are going to be happy and have good feelings and not depressed most of the time into a better place, and people who might be vulnerable to depression into a worse place. Hope that answers the question.
And we have another one. Did the research studying creatine and teen girls control for other interventions, pardon me, such as counseling and therapy?
It did, yeah. So they were not getting therapy during the study. They weren't getting any other treatment. So I think they were just getting creatine and not taking antidepressants at that point. But, I should emphasize that's a very preliminary study. So was not placebo controlled, very small group. So hard to generalize from that to the treatment of teen girls with depression.
So Brent, I have a question for you. I work at NAMI, and I also co-chair the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition. And often when doing trainings like QPR or whatever, or presentations, we get asked the question of altitude and suicide. And we've been taught, or when we discuss this, is that suicide there's not one cause to suicide, that there are very many reasons for someone to die by suicide, and altitude wouldn't be the only cause. I don't know, how would you address that with your knowledge so that I might better answer those questions when I'm talking to others?
Well, I think I would say exactly the same thing, Benny. I would never claim that altitude is the end all and be all of suicide, right? We think of it as really just one factor. And we're mainly interested in it as a way of understanding what doctors call the pathophysiology of depression and suicide. What's the underlying physical or biological change that ultimately predisposes somebody to taking their life? But clearly, lots of other things have to happen. You know, if you don't have a lot of life stressors, if you haven't been traumatized or abused, if you're not socially marginalized, if you're economically well situated, if you don't use substances or smoke, if you don't have access to guns, you're probably not going to kill yourself, even if you live in Nepal, right? So it takes many, many changes all adding together. And, you know, my guess is that the biology kind of has a final common pathway. So serotonin and brain bioenergetics and the way different parts of the brain talk to each other are affected by all of those things that we just talked about. We know stress, inflammation, trauma, substance use, all of those things can independently manipulate brain energy storage. They can independently affect serotonin levels, NMDA signaling, communication between the front part of the brain and the emotional parts of the brain, and so on.
Thank you.
Just to pick up on one other thing about your question, you know, some people one of the guys from Imagine Dragons actually had really criticized our work, saying like, these guys are saying that it's responsible for the change in suicide rates in Utah. Well, clearly we don't think that because the mountains aren't getting dramatically higher. We're thinking this is a predisposing factor. And then things like culture and attitudes in the church towards people who are LGBTQ and things like that also add into that and affect the risk for individuals. Looks like a question in the chat. So has the suicide altitude correlation been studied in Nepal, other high altitude places, same correlation in other countries? Great question. So it has been studied in Nepal. They did not find an association there, but the study was very poorly designed. They basically just took people coming into a psychiatric clinic at high elevation and people coming into a psychiatric clinic at low elevation, relatively low elevation in Kathmandu, and found that they had about the same percentage of people who were depressed. But, you know, people going into a psychiatric clinic are going to tend to be depressed anyway. So it's not surprising they didn't see a difference. In other countries, the association is very clear. So these findings have been replicated in Switzerland, in Peru, in Chile, in Spain, I think in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey. So, yeah, and most significantly in South Korea, actually, where we've had a lot of collaborators. So, you know, I'm very convinced it's a global phenomenon and not just some Intermountain West idiosyncrasy.
If anyone else has another question, we can go ahead and then we'll move on to our discussion, or about 15 minutes with NAMI. And pardon me, I have a tickle in my throat too, and with NAMI and AFSP.
Brent, I have a question. I find this all so interesting, and apologies if you mentioned this, but is there a difference between how our major organs deal with the decrease in oxygen, like our lungs and our heart, versus our brain?
So, yeah, I think there are differences, you know, largely related to what the different organs do. You know, your muscles actually, if you move from low elevation to high elevation, just tend to get smaller. And, that's why they say to athletes, live low and train high, right? Because no, it's the other way around, actually. But the idea is that if you spend all of your time at high elevation, then you're not going to be able to develop a lot of muscle mass. You just want occasional hypoxic stress to boost your blood counts and cause other physiologic adaptation, and then that makes you a more effective cyclist. So that's why people like Lance Armstrong, in addition to using EPO and steroids and stuff like that, often spent time in hypoxic tents, living high and training low. And, muscle has a lot of other adaptations in terms of the composition of the muscle fibers. Of course, your circulatory system adapts in tons of ways. There tends to be more vascularization, more smaller blood vessels. Most people have increased blood counts when they move to high elevation. Heart rate tends to get a little bit higher. The heart itself actually remodels, so it becomes a somewhat more efficient pump. But then, some people find that remodeling actually ends up causing more problems. So there's data to suggest that rates of heart failure of certain kinds are actually a little bit more common at high elevation. Does that answer your question, Dawn?
Yeah, I was just wondering why we're not smarter at higher elevation.
Why we're not smarter?
Just because, when you're saying the like sleep high, train low, like there's so many elite athletes who live at elevation, and it doesn't, I don't know, but that's why I asked if, it seems like their lungs are doing just fine. And I just wondered if there was any correlation with how our major organs are surviving at altitude.
Yeah. I guess if I wanted to be an elite athlete, would probably not try to live at elevation unless it was necessary to the sport, right? So, obviously, if you want to be a great cross-country skier, Utah's a pretty good place, or a great downhill skier, it's a fabulous place. But maybe not a great place to train to be a cyclist. And then another way to think about this is what happens to people like Sherpas who are genetically adapted to living at high elevation for many, many generations. They have clear physiological differences and clear genetic differences that affect primarily their circulatory system. There's a very clear prevalence of a mutation in hemoglobin that allows them to hold on to oxygen a little bit more tightly, so that they can suck more oxygen out of the air that they breathe in, and then release it into the tissues. So a lot of interesting changes there.
Anyone else? Okay. So we will, thank you very much. I thought that was extremely interesting. And I like the fact that you are studying and interested in using natural supplements to help people have to deal with this. So our next little 15 minutes, I wanted to add on a portion of this talk to be about some of our organizations that are here in Utah that can help the families, people struggling with mental illness, and how you can help others, and you can pose your questions to them as well. And so I should have said in the beginning that topics that we're going to cover tonight can be triggering, and they will continue. There's topics will still come up that can be triggering when we're talking to our next two presenters. So we have Tori Yates, and she is, need to mute you, Milan. Okay, sorry. Tori Yates has been involved in the mental health field for nearly 20 years. Employee at UNI, which is now the Huntsman Mental Health Institute. And she also works with the West Valley Police Department as their in-house social worker. She's a current president of American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Utah chapter, and has been involved in the Safe Utah app and the crisis intervention team. So American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, their mission is to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. And then we also have Benny Larson, who is a program director at NAMI and is their prevention by design director. And NAMI is the National Alliance of Mental Illness. And if either of Tori or Benny, if you want to start off this conversation, or I can even throw some ideas at people, people can ask questions on, how to recognize someone with depression or suicide ideations, or what is a suicide ideation, and how we can help, resources, signs to look for, and the such. And Benny and Tori, you'll have to unmute yourself. I can do it.
Okay, well, I will start, just give you a little bit of an idea of what depression is, kind of what we look at when we are actually maybe diagnosing somebody with depression, or when either you or a loved one should probably go talk to your doctor about the feelings that you're having. So for a lot of people, it can be as simple as just not sleeping well, either sleeping too much or too little, but that kind of coupled with feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, feelings of not really enjoying the things that you used to enjoy. Especially in kids, it can present as a lot of aggression or anger. It can for adults too, but mostly in kids, that's usually what we tend to see a little bit more of. And a lot of times it can also affect your appetite. So if you're having no appetite or you're eating more than usual, basically, if you or somebody that you love is experiencing behaviors that are not normal for them, that's probably the best time to go talk to somebody. And you can even start with your primary care doctor. They can go through the checklist with you, make sure that, based on the checklist that Dr. Kious talked about, we can determine whether or not they need to maybe be put on medication, maybe go to therapy, and kind of triage the symptoms that way. But if anybody is talking about suicide specifically, or not wanting to be around anymore, anything like that needs to have immediate intervention. And so the best thing to do at that time, you can call up to Huntsman Mental Health Institute. They have mobile crisis teams that actually can come out into the community, to your home, talk with you, talk with your family member, and kind of decide what needs to happen next. Does it rise to the level of maybe needing an inpatient admission, or is it something that can be handled on an outpatient basis? Going to an ER can sometimes be scary for people. And so having that resource, they've been around now for actually almost 10 years. And so being able to have that resource in your home, where you're feeling maybe a little bit more comfortable about talking, is a huge benefit to our community. The people that come out when you call for the mobile teams would be a licensed clinician and a certified peer specialist. So somebody who has had a lived experience. Sorry, I get on Zoom and apparently my cats decide they need attention. So at that point, the nice thing about having a certified peer specialist is it's somebody that's already kind of been in your shoes, has experienced their own mental health crisis, and can really identify with what you're going through at the time. And so that pair comes out, talks to you, gives you resources, and just kind of, if need be, will follow up with you in the future if you need that. So yeah, sorry, my brain's kind of, it's late in the evening for me, so my morning starts at 7. So I'll turn it over to Brene and we'll kind of go from there.
All right, thanks, Tori. So I work at NAMI Utah, and so for those of you who are not familiar with NAMI, it's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It is a nonprofit. It's a national nonprofit. It was started by moms as kind of like a grassroots effort to find treatments for their kids who were experiencing mental health conditions, and they realized there just wasn't a lot of support, not only for their children, but for them as parents and families. So we offer classes that, like, our whole kind of mantra or whatever is like education, advocacy, and support. So education is our big push, is to educate family members about mental illnesses, how to support their loved one who has a mental health condition, classes for adults who have a mental health condition, and then we have a really great class for teenagers that's called Progression, and it's where teens 13 to 18 get to learn about their mental health condition in fun, teenager kind of ways. And we have a class for parents called Basics, and it really just gives you some information on the different types of mental illnesses, signs, symptoms, treatment options, different coping mechanisms. But it's a super helpful way to take control of your mental health condition, because it lets you know and feel educated for that. All of our classes are free. All of our classes and support groups are online, and they are fairly open. And Sarah, I can give you a copy of our latest program flyer. You can click on it and register for any of them right now. They go on pretty regularly. One of the great things that NAMI has that most people don't know about is our mentor line. Just like Tori was talking about, peer-led support is really what NAMI is all about. We have people who have lived experience, and so our mentor line you can call Monday through Friday from 9 to 4, and it is answered by individuals who either have a mental health condition or have a family member, and they can walk you through how to go through the system, because the mental health care system can be pretty daunting. And if this is something you've never done before and you don't know where to start, a NAMI mentor is a great place to start. They are some of the kindest, most wonderful patient people I've ever met, and all of them have been at NAMI for more than 10 years. One just celebrated 20 years. She's been doing this forever, and she's a sweetheart. But they get it because they do this on their own regularly with either themselves or their family members, and they know all the resources that are available. They can help you figure out how to get from point A to point B and where to look, because sometimes it can be really overwhelming. We know if you're struggling with depression or anxiety, the thought of making a whole bunch of phone calls is sometimes more than people can handle. So having somebody that can walk you through it is amazing. So please utilize our mentor line, because it is there for anybody to use.
There's a question I put NAMI's website in the chat, and then, NAMI Utah. And then there's a question. I am on a peer support group currently at my place of employment. How does one become a certified peer specialist?
So I know that through the state has a peer support specialist. I don't know if you're familiar with that as much, Tori, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually through the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and they do periodically. With COVID and everything, they really haven't done as many courses, but it's usually a week-long course that essentially teaches people how to safely share their story, because that's a lot of what certified peer specialists are in the community, to provide hope to those that have a mental health condition. And so through that course, you learn how to provide that hope in the way that you interact with the individuals that you're dealing with and working with, and also how to safely share your story and your experiences. That's a big thing that AFSP also really touts, is safely explaining how your loss affected you without talking about means and things like that can be triggering to other people. That's one thing I kind of forgot to share, is some of the stuff that AFSP specifically does is education. So we do a lot of kind of what NAMI does as well. We have Safe Talk, which is education, usually depending on what the need is, it can be anywhere from a couple of hours to about a 4-hour presentation about how to identify suicide, suicide risk factors, and really how to talk to somebody and then refer them into getting some help and where they can actually go to make sure that they get that help, the help that they need. And I'm actually going to add into the chat, this is specifically AFSP Utah's website. You can go on there and there's usually a calendar of events that we're having. They're free to the public. Anybody can come and join. A lot of it's been done on Zoom just because of COVID and everything. So we do a lot of presentations that way. We also have a large volunteer base. So if anybody wants to volunteer, we do a lot of tabling events. We provide a lot of just education back to the community. We have a walk every year that just happened back in September. It's usually during the week of Suicide Prevention Week. That's held in September every year. This last year, we did it on 9/11 at the Veterans Memorial Park in West Jordan, and incorporated into our opening ceremony a bunch of military and police and first responders. And it was probably one of the most, I don't know if Benet was there, but I know a lot of NAMI people were there. And it was a very moving, somewhat difficult at times, because it was very touching for a lot of our people, especially because first responders, we lose more of them to suicide than we do in the line of death, more suicides in first responders than we do, like I said, it's late in the evening for me, than we do in like line of duty deaths. So they're a very high, as a population, they have a very high risk factor for suicide, just because of, like Benet said, a lot of the risk factors are just, their everyday jobs are very stressful and difficult. So, but we raise money during our walk. That money goes to national. Half of that, whatever we raise, comes back here, and it's all used for paper materials that we provide to individuals. We provide suicide prevention training and education, and we actually, if we do have somebody that does have loss to suicide in their family, we actually provide a service where we go out and talk with them and provide some peer-to-peer kind of mentorship and kind of help them through that, as well as we have survivor boxes that we also provide to the family that has a plethora of different resources available as well. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Tori. Hey, and I also wanted to mention part of my role at NAMI, I oversee a suicide prevention grant from the state, from the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health. And through that, I co-chair the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition. Our coalition website, I put it in the chat, it's liveonutah.org, which is the new kind of campaign for suicide prevention across the state. But all things suicide prevention you can find there. You can find resources that Tori talked about from AFSP. We have some really great lived experience stories, one from like Taryn Hyatt, who is over AFSP here in Utah and Nevada. There are lots of we're actually updating the website right now, like probably it'll be live tomorrow or Monday at the latest, where you can go step by step what to do to find a healthcare provider. There's going to be a video on how to go about that. There's some NAMI resources there. There are also different work groups that work on different topics that are on there. So youth, faith, there's a faith work group. There is a workplace work group. So there's different topics. So any kind of topic or training, any trainings from across the state for suicide prevention, like Safe Talk that Tori talked about. QPR is another really good training. I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about how to prevent suicide, is to take a basic training. That gives you the skills and the practice on how to ask somebody if they're thinking about suicide, but also giving you some noticing skills on what to look for.
I'd suggest, I've taken that QPR one. I've actually been through it twice, and I suggest that to everybody. It's and we've done it in Alta in person and offered it online. It's a very simple, clean program. You can learn very fast, simple things.
Yes, definitely.
And it's called QPR, Q as in queen, for those that
so it means question, persuade, and refer. So you just learn how to ask the question and persuade someone to live, and then refer them to the help that they need. So it's really pretty basic, but if we could have everybody trained in QPR, we would save lives every day. It would be perfect and wonderful. So please take it if you're at all interested. I recommend it for everyone.
And I did, the second time I did it, I found it very helpful. I was like, oh yeah, needed to remember that one. Does any of the attendees have any questions? And anyone that's a part of this group, let me know of any upcoming events you'd like to see us cover, whether it's, continuing any of these conversations. We love ideas and be able to provide for everybody. Well, it is 8 o'clock. And I really would like to thank our presenters for taking the time this evening outside of normal office hours to talk to the community here, and hopefully we can involve you again. So thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting us, Sarah. It was fun.
It was really interesting. Thank you.
And thank you for your research. It's so interesting. Thanks.
And if anyone wants this recording, we will have it. So thank you.